Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival virtual event in our series of online interviews with writers, Australian and international. My name is Catherine Dupelou-Ménager, and I'm the Artistic Director of Bad Sydney. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. And I'm speaking to you today from darkened land just outside Sydney. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, and there's practically nobody who isn't, we're an annual festival featuring crime writing or celebrating crime writing of all kinds. And we also run events throughout the year. Sadly, in the last 18 months, these have been more online than in person. But that will change, although not immediately, because like everybody in New South Wales and people in other parts of Australia, we're in lockdown. In New South Wales, we won't be out till the end of September. So our festival is going to be from the 2nd to the 5th of December with a wonderful lineup of talented fiction and true crime writers. Before we start, I want to thank our sponsors, the City of Sydney and Create New South Wales, who make all this possible. We have a relationship with an online bookseller, Booktopia, and that's where you can buy Charlie's books. We very much appreciate their support. And now to tonight's interview. I'd like to welcome American writer Charlie Donlea, who is joining us from Chicago at the unseemly hour of 5 o'clock. Welcome, Charlie. But you say you get up at this time anyway, so it's not such a big deal.
It's my writing time. So
okay, I don't feel quite as guilty. But we really appreciate you being here with us. So Charlie's first book was called Summit Lake, and you've written, I think, 6 other books since then. Now, I've read 2 of them, which I have loved, The Suicide House, and you've told me one of the characters appears in another book, so that's good to know. And I really liked 20 Years Later. So I'm looking forward to hearing about it, but Andy's going to be very careful with no spoilers at all. Charlie will be talking to Andy Muir, who's also a writer. Andy is a writer in many different veins. He writes for television and he also writes crime fiction. I always think writers are very good interviewers because they know just what to ask, what the difficulties are and what the decisions you have to make. Listening to us tonight are members of the Bad Sydney community, and we have many listeners from libraries throughout New South Wales. They were actually going to be streaming this event live into their libraries and some rural libraries as well. But that wasn't possible because of lockdown. We're very happy, though, to welcome individual library users from, I think, Hawkesbury Library, Lithgow Library, Newcastle Library, and Narromine. So, Charlie, a bit of a quick geography lesson for you there. Now, very, very briefly, what we'll be doing now is I will disappear shortly. Andy and Charlie will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. Hold on to your questions, about 40 minutes. Then Andy will tell you to put them into the Q&A function, and he will ask Charlie the questions. I will come back for a minute at the end to say thank you and tell you and appreciate how wonderful it was. Thank you to both our speakers. And then we will say goodbye. But now I will disappear and leave you with Charlie and Andy.
Well, thanks for that great intro there, Catherine. And thank you, Charlie, for joining us this morning. It is quite early over there in Chicago.
Yeah, it's 5 a.m. here, but like I said, this is when I usually am up writing. So I'm talking to you. If nothing else, I'm procrastinating my day of writing a little bit.
That's right. As Catherine said, as writers, we kind of understand that stuff, procrastinating, as we kind of call it. We're kind of mucking around at the edges. So this is Charlie's book, 20 years later. I've got my blur function on, so it's kind of, when I go like that, it looks like it's the censored version. But anyway, that's what it is for everyone. Keep an eye out for it. Now, it is your 6th book. It involves a 20-year-old cold case where the murder suspect died in the World Trade Center attack on 9/11, which is one of those points in history where it really is, it's a touchstone. You can sort of see the before and after really clearly. And we kind of forget that, 2001, we didn't have iPhones, there was no Facebook, there was no social media, there was no COVID. It's quite a different time, and it's a perfect catalyst or setting for a story. Do you remember where you were on 9/11, Charlie?
Yeah, strangely, I was at home writing, not strangely, but I had, at the time, I was an unpublished aspiring author. And I used to keep track of my word count on this spiral piece of paper. And every day I would write how many words I wrote and how many words I had total for that was the first book, a first manuscript I was ever trying to write. And when 9/11 happened, I remember the news was on in the other room, and I just, got up from my desk and started watching it. And I still kept that manuscript. Never, I finished it, but it was never published. But I still have that piece of paper where I recorded the words that I wrote that day, and then I put a little American flag, and I didn't write for that week because we were consumed by the events of 9/11. So yeah, I remember that day distinctly of where I was at in writing at my desk.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, because I remember I was watching The West Wing, because it was late at night here, and they kind of cut into The West Wing. It was kind of like, it was this weird sort of juxtaposition of like, is this part of the show, or is it, it was a surreal moment.
Yes, I'm sure that would be surreal.
Yeah, but before we kind of really sort of get into your latest book, I thought it'd be great to sort of introduce you to the readers that are with us tonight. And sort of in preparing for this chat, I've read a bit of your blog and listened to some of the other interviews. And the thing that really struck me is that writing sort of came to you later. It wasn't sort of it doesn't seem to be an early ambition for you.
It wasn't. And as a matter of fact, when I do talks to high schools in the area, I always talk to the English director, and I say, I got to tell you, my story is not the typical story, and I want to make sure that my message is okay for the students, because I hated reading when I was a kid, and I did everything I could to avoid actually reading anything in school. I never read an assigned novel that I was given. Back when I was in school, we had things called Cliff's Notes, which was a very abbreviated version of whatever assignment we were meant to read, because I didn't enjoy reading at all. And like I said, I managed to get through my entire academic career without ever reading an assigned novel. And so not only did I not like to read, I obviously had no aspirations to write. Never took a creative writing course. It was never on my radar until I was in college. I read John Grisham's book, The Firm. And somehow, having never read a book before, I not only fell in love with the suspense and the story and the feeling that book gave me. It's like I couldn't stop reading it. I couldn't, when I went off to class, I couldn't wait to get back to it. When I got to the end of the book, I didn't want it to end because I was enjoying it so much. But when I finished the book, I was studying science at the time on the way to medical school. And I thought, I'm going to write a book someday, even though if I thought about it rationally, I had no training. I had most writers love to read, and they'd been reading since they were kids, and they were writing short stories when they were younger. So I had none of that, but I had inspiration from John Grisham's book. And later in life, I sat down when I was finished with schooling and started writing. And it took me years and years to finish a manuscript, lots of rejection. And Summit Lake, which was my first book, is actually my fourth manuscript that I wrote, that I finally broke in with. So yeah, a little bit of a non-traditional story of how I came to be a writer. But I wouldn't have it any other way, because my sort of passion comes from being inspired in an area I never knew that I was interested in until I started reading.
Yeah, yeah, it's really yeah, I was really struck by that, because it is that kind of traditional. The traditional narrative is, the always reading, always writing, and go through a Master of Fine Arts or something, short story competitions. But you're sort of a self-made author.
Yeah, I'm a self-taught author, that's for sure. And when I was going through all the rejections of trying to find an agent for that first manuscript that I was writing during 9/11, I got some of the best advice for my career from an agent that actually called to tell me he hated the manuscript, but he told me in the process, he said, you're a good writer, but you don't know how to write thrillers, which is what I was trying to write at the time. And he said, so you know how to write. I can tell you have some writing ability, but you know how to write thrillers. So go figure that out. And when I asked him, how do I learn how to write the thrillers? And he said, read a bunch of thrillers and read them from the author's perspective, and then write them from the reader's perspective. And that's been the best piece of advice I've had in my career, because part of the reason when I read a book, Andy, you're probably the same way as a writer, but when I read a book, I'm trying to figure out what the author's mindset is during each passage in each chapter. And then when I'm writing a book, I'm trying to figure out the mindset of the reader, and trying to figure out what I want the reader to feel and to sense in this passage that I'm writing. And that little bit of just advice helped me, because from that point on, I basically studied thrillers. I read, Robert Ludlum and Dennis Lehane, and I was reading all of these books, sort of breaking them down and taking notes as if they were a course in a textbook, trying to figure out, why do I like those characters? How is this feeling of suspense being created? And that's gone a long way to what people would say is a self-taught writer.
Mm. Yeah, it's really that's sort of putting yourself into the head of your reader is such a crucial skill. Like, do you actually have your ideal reader? Is there someone out there that you're kind of projecting your work onto, or is it just a general...
I don't know if I'm writing for them. I don't know if I'm writing for them. I have a couple of first readers that I always share my early stuff with. That's my wife and my sister. They read the early garbage, the first 100 pages, that parts of which can be magical, but most of which is awful. And it's just, I need them to tell me the parts they love, and specifically the parts they hate, because then I'll go back in and get rid of the parts that they hate and elaborate on parts that they love. But I think, your circle of readers at this stage of my career, it comes down to my first readers, my wife and my sister, and then my secondary readers, which is my agent and my editor. Those are the people that I care most about getting positive feedback from. By the time I give them the manuscript, I'm hoping that they love it. When I give my wife and my sister the manuscript, unfortunately for them, there's a lot of bad stuff in the manuscript still that they're helping me root out. So my ideal reader, I have a few of them that I'm trying to write for initially, before I get to the broad, audience of the readers that read the book commercially.
Yeah, I think writers' partners really suffer a lot, probably more than the writer.
They do. They certainly, my wife hasn't read a good book from me in years, because she's never really seen the good part of it. And when the book is finally all finished, and it is, 20 years later, the final manuscript, which I love, she's read so much of the bad stuff about it that she's burned out on the story, and she's not really, perhaps she'll listen to it on Audible, but yeah, she gets to see all the bad stuff before the final you know, and really she doesn't always read the final version of it.
Yeah, yeah. Do you talk about your work a lot? I mean, I always sort of want to talk about my story. It's probably my television background, but I'm always kind of, my partner's going, I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear. It's like, you know.
Well, I don't talk about it with, like, my editor always says, well, you know, tell me what it's about, bounce some ideas off of me. And
Yeah.
I'm really careful, strangely, not to tell him anything, because I want him to see the final version and to help me make that better. I don't want him in the weeds with me trying to figure out the nitty gritty of the story, because, like, for my wife and my sister, it ruins the story for them. They know the twists, they know the surprises, they know the ending, they know what I'm trying to do, and they're helping me get there. When I give it to my editor and my agent, I want them to experience all those twists and surprises for the first time. So I don't talk about my book to my professional team. I talk about it with my first readers and my wife and my sister, helping me sort of root out all the problems with the manuscript.
Yeah. So in terms of your writing process, do you do the detailed synopsis and breakdown and map it all out, or you sort of more?
Yeah, I outline to an extent. You know, I think I've talked to a lot of writers who don't outline at all, and they find it, you know, I always find it fascinating. You outline and it makes it seem like the process is easier, and maybe it is, because I haven't written a book straight through. I mean, I've tried it. Summit Lake was sort of my attempt to write without an outline. But it took me a long time. It took me years to write it rather than months, because I'm sort of wandering through this wilderness, not with any specific direction. So back to John Grisham, who's sort of inspired me to write originally. He has some rules for writers. And one of his rules is, don't write the first chapter until you know how the last chapter is going to end. And for me, I try to write a good outline. And part of the outline, even if the middle is not fully worked out, the beginning is good and the ending is good. So I know where I'm trying to get the story to. Because, you know, the hardest part, Andy, as a writer, is writing the middle part of the book. You have to bridge this, you know, you're very excited at the beginning, you're writing about new characters, new events, you're trying to dramatically set up the conflict that the characters are going to go through, and you know hopefully how it's going to end. But that middle part is very hard, and you don't always have it worked out. Even if you, for me, even when I outline, I don't have all of that worked out. For my second novel, called The Girl Who Was Taken, I turned in a very elaborate, like 50-page outline to my editor. And then I went dark for 6 months while I wrote the book. And when I turned the manuscript into him, he called me and he said, you know, I really love the manuscript. It has nothing to do with the outline that you sent me. Because the creative process, even though I had a map of where I wanted to go, the creative process just took me in a different direction. So I use an outline in the sense that it helps me start, and it gives me an idea of where I want the story to go. But much of the daily writing, especially in the middle of the book, is just comes from the creative process. And I think, Andy, you can, as a writer, you know, the beginning of the book, once you know the characters, that gets you like 50 or 60% of the way through. Once you know the characters, when you get to that part of the book, the middle of the book, you know them so much better that if the story's working, the characters are going to take the story the rest of the way. You can guide them and steer them. But where I find where writer's block comes in is when something with the story is not working, and I know it's not working, and the characters sort of know it's not working. And to get out of the writer's block, I go back to my outline and I start figuring out what that problem is. Once I find a path around the problem, then it just pours out of you for a while until you get stuck again. And I go back to the outline and rework the problems.
Yeah. Do you find it when you're in those moments, it's because you've deviated too far from the outline?
Yeah, not necessarily. The outline is important, but I think you can't, for me, I can't strictly stay with the outline, because there are times you learn things about the story and the characters and their conflicts that you didn't have in the outline, because you didn't know, when you were writing the outline, you didn't know the story that well, you didn't know the characters that well. So I think it's the opposite. I mean, sometimes when I'm trying to stick too stringently to an outline which contained an idea I had months ago, I have to stop myself and say, that's not going to work anymore. This doesn't fit this character that has now become this living person in my mind. She would never do that. So I have to pivot, go back to the outline, rework it so that I can get the character to the next place in the story, and then start writing again. So more of writing block comes from the story wanting to go in a different direction than my original thoughts. And you have to reconcile that, and then the story starts working itself out.
Yeah, yeah. And so is the story the thing that comes to you first, or the character?
You know, it depends on which manuscript it is.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
There's a character in my previous two books, The Woman in Darkness and The Suicide House. And those books were very much centered around this character. Rory Moore is an autistic cold case investigator. And so I came up with her character and sort of all her the quirkiness of this character before I created a story around her. In 20 years later, I definitely had the idea of a story and what I was hoping, the story I was hoping to tell before I developed the character, the two main characters to tell that story.
Yeah, because it's interesting, like with, thriller writing and crime writing, you have to be so careful with those elements. Like it's sort of, it is a puzzle, and the puzzle's got to make sense at the end. It's got to add up properly. But also you've got a readership that know all the tricks and know, the tropes. And so you've got to kind of satisfy them by doing something different that will, deliver. So it's probably because, it's what I write as well. But I think it is the most challenging of narratives to try and wrestle with.
For sure. And you probably get it all the time. The question is, now that you're on your 7th novel, isn't it easier to write? No, I mean, it's not. I've never sat down and felt that a novel was easy to write for that exact reason. We write thrillers. And so the thriller audience, they're astute readers who pride themselves on figuring out the twist before they get to that part of the book. If you ever read any reviews on a book, not your own, but any book, one of the biggest topics was, well, I figured out the twist before it got there, but it was still a good book. And so as the writer, I mean, we're fighting against this dilemma every time. We're trying to trick the reader and trying to mislead the reader, but we have to do it honestly. We can't we can't do it in a way that's really deceiving the reader. We can allow the reader to assume certain things while they read the book. I know we can't get too much into 20 years later, but there's a sleight of hand that goes on in the story of 20 years later. I want to surprise the reader at the end. I want to give them a shocking ending that's realistic, but I don't want them to see it coming. And it's very hard to do that when you're writing for for readers who are specifically trying to figure the book out. So, some readers are just along for the ride. I want to read and be shocked. But there are a lot of amateur sleuths who are readers of thrillers, and they want to figure the book out before they get to the final page. And I love those readers, but it's also a challenge to surprise them and trick them each time you write a book. And it doesn't get easier on the next book, not at all.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting with your run of books. I mean, so you got Summit Lake, we got Kelsey Castle. Then you got The Girl Who Was Taken, which is Livia Cutty. Don't Believe It, Sydney Ryan. The Woman in the Darkness, or Someone in the Darkness, depending on what country you're in. Rory Moore, and The Suicide House, Rory Moore again. And then 20 years later, you got Avery Mason. So you've kind of got a couple of characters that are returning, and then you've got a couple of standalones as well. Do you prefer kind of going into new territory, or do you like revisiting your characters?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to be said about writing a series. I mean, I have 2 books with the same character, and I don't call that a series. They can be read in either order. The Woman in Darkness and The Suicide House, they can be read in either order, but they just have the same character in it. A lot of my books, first of all of the books can be read as standalone. None of them are based on a previous one. So you can start with any book, and they all have their own character in it. I think for me, this journey for me in the last few years of writing a book a year, there are certain characters that sort of live inside of my mind and always sort of are calling for me. I need another story. I want to be in this story. And so as I'm writing a new story, 20 years later, for instance, Avery Mason is a brand new character. I've never met her before. I'm developing her and creating her, and I'm starting, once you get into the story, I start to love this character. She happens to need some help with some forensics because she's working in a cold case. And immediately what pops into my mind is that previous character of mine from The Girl Who Was Taken, Livia Cutty, because she's an expert in forensics. She's a forensic pathologist. So I know in my mind that Livia has the answers that Avery needs. And so it's natural for me to try to put these 2 characters together. Now, if someone's never read my novels, they're going to be able to read 20 years later, and they won't miss a beat. There's nothing to know before you go into that book. But if you have read a few of my books, you'll see 1 or 2 characters that you've seen before in previous novels. And that might be a thrill for you, for the reader. The purpose for me to do it is I'm solving a problem for my main character by bringing other characters back, because these other characters I've created have skills that my new main character needs. And that's really the purpose of that. And that's been the purpose through every time a character has sort of popped up in a subsequent novel.
Yeah, they're almost like little Easter eggs. Yeah, little Easter eggs for the readers.
Yes.
But it is interesting, all of your books, they kind of have this connection with sort of media and journalism. You've got podcasts, you've got documentary makers. So one's got a book, and the cold case sort of comes through this sort of investigation. What attracts you to these sorts of characters, these characters that are working within the sort of outside the law?
One of my observations about American society, at least, is this morbid fascination we have with not necessarily true crime, but this morbid fascination we have with victims of, say, abduction, for instance. When I wrote The Girl Who Was Taken, it's about 2 girls who disappear. They get abducted. One shows up and one's never seen again. The one who escapes ends up writing this memoir that tells about her time in captivity and about her escape, and it becomes this big bestseller. And everybody's dying to read about the morbid details about this girl's story. And that came from, and all the subsequent books, in 20 years later, we're talking about a television journalist who's chasing this story of a 20-year-old cold case murder. These ideas come from this sort of societal urge we have to delve into this, our morbid curiosity with abduction and with murder. I don't know where it comes from. I'm guilty of it myself, but if you walk past a supermarket tabloid, oftentimes there's a story about an abducted girl. You know, where are they now? If they were found, what are they doing now? Did they survive? Are they thriving? And this has sort of been a fascination of mine for a while. Why as a society we're so interested in this? I don't have the answer, but my characters have sort of followed in that realm where they're looking at cold cases, or they were actually part of some sort of tragedy or an abduction that has happened. And my interest with this, I take it on as a journalistic viewpoint, or the point of view of either a documentary filmmaker, or in 20 years later, she's the star of a show called American Events, which is essentially like a 2020 or a Dateline here in the United States. And she jumps on this cold case, and she knows that her audience is going to love this cold case murder, and she starts investigating it. That just comes from our culture of sort of this morbid curiosity we have with tragedy. I don't know why we have it, but that's where the characters are derived.
Yeah, yeah, and it goes back to the Lindbergh baby, doesn't it? I mean, it's such a part of well, Western culture, really. It's not just America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Why we're just, like I said, it's like seeing a wreck on the road. You can't drive past it. You gotta look at it. You got to see what you can see, and we sort of take that mentality into any sort of tragedy that becomes public and starts to gain the attention of the press. Yeah.
Now you kind of just gave a little bit of a précis of 20 years later. So you kind of ruined my my little intro that I was going to give you, but it's as we kind of, if the listeners have probably worked out that it is involving a cold case around 9/11. It's a new, they've worked out a new technique to identify a victim through a bone fragment, and there's a twist in that the victim was a suspect in a murder 20 years ago, and this Avery, the TV host, kind of thinks this is going to be a great story for her TV show, but then of course she's got her own sort of secrets and things that she wants to kind of keep hidden too. The story kind of has three parts, doesn't it? It's sort of, you've got the cold case, you've got and this victim Victoria, and sort of what happened to her. Then you got Avery and her sort of TV journey and what's happening with the show and her sort of career. And then you've also got this FBI agent, Walt, who's kind of ends up working with Avery. It's, keeping those strands moving must have been quite a challenge.
Yeah, it was. That's the part, Andy, as a writer, where you have three strands and you get to a certain part of the novel, 50 or 60% of the way. And those three, now you finally see how they're all going to come together. And from that point, that's when writing's really fun. Developing the strands and organizing them to get to that part is really the challenging part of writing. But once they come together, it's really interesting. So yeah, with 20 years later, there was an HBO documentary called McMillions, which was the story of a scam artist who was scamming the McDonald's Monopoly game in the United States. And he had done this for years, and they would give away millions of dollars. And he found a way, he was on the inside of McDonald's, to always get the winning tickets. So he was giving the winning tickets away to his family and friends. But anyways, the FBI found out about this, and they did this massive undercover operation. And right on the verge of all the indictments, 9/11 happened. And the case sort of went up in smoke, and nobody was interested in, figuring out who was scamming McDonald's anymore after 9/11. And so I took a little bit I sort of stole from that story in the sense that there's this murder investigation happening, and the suspect is all the evidence points that she did it, and she's on the verge of being indicted, and then 9/11 happens, and she's in one of the towers during 9/11. That's Victoria's story. Avery's story is 20 years later, this new DNA technology, which is a real thing, a real technology that's been developed, is able to identify bone fragments of victims of the 9/11 attack that have not yet been identified. So they make their first positive identification in years. Avery goes to New York to tell this story about how the DNA technology has evolved. And she finds out that the victim was Victoria Ford, that's just been identified. And when she talks to Victoria's family, she realizes that, Victoria was involved in this murder investigation. And Victoria's sister believes that Victoria's been innocent and was innocent back then and hasn't been able to prove it. And so she asks Avery to help her prove it. So now Avery, going into it thinking she was going to tell a story about a 9/11 victim being identified, now is on the sort of verge of reinvestigating a 20-year-old cold case. And for her show, which deals with true crime, this is like ratings gold. And she thinks she wants to now tell this story about Victoria Ford and prove that she's innocent. And then the third part of the story is this Walt Jenkins, this retired FBI agent who's lured out of retirement with the proposition of going undercover and, for lack of a better word, spying on Avery Mason, because the feds think that Avery knows the whereabouts of her fugitive father. And so those are the three storylines, and they all come together to bring these three stories together sort of explosively, and I hope with a surprise twist ending.
I was definitely, as I was sort of saying earlier, reading as a writer and a reader, I was kind of trying to put it all together, and I had a completely different ending, which I'll send you an email about it rather than share it with everyone because it probably revealed too much. But
I want to read it.
But I really enjoyed it. I particularly loved Walt. I thought Walt was just, a great character. I'd love to see a spin-off with Walt. It's and he taught me so much about rum. I didn't realize that rum was like whiskey.
Walt started out as like the secondary character that didn't have a big role in we're talking about an outline. He didn't have a big role when I was writing the outline, but as I wrote his story, he just took over and became sort of like a second protagonist to Avery. But Walt admits, he's a cliche. He's an FBI agent who was involved in a scandal, and he was sort of released from the FBI disgracefully, and he goes to Jamaica to sort of get away from everything. He thinks he's going to go for a month, and we meet him there. He's been there for 3 years. He's become a bit of a beach bum. His favorite spirit is single batch Jamaican rum, and he's sitting at the bar one day, and his old FBI boss shows up with this offer to come out of retirement, go undercover. And it's sort of an offer Walt can't refuse because he's in a downward spiral at that point. And he's still young, he's in his 40s. But this offer to go sort of spy on a famous television journalist and sort of find out what she knows about her fugitive father is exactly what Walt needs to sort of get him out of his funk. But of course, he goes to meet Avery, and things don't go perfectly as planned. And Walt's story ended up being much bigger than I originally imagined. But he too is one of my favorite characters for sure.
Yeah, there's a real sort of even though he kind of plays with those tropes and the sort of the things we expect of an ex-grizzled FBI agent, he was just sort of kind of fun. He was a really nice counterpoint to Avery as well. He was this kind of young, really driven journalist who's kind of quite bolshy in the way that she's kind of handling things at the network. And then there's this grizzled old Walt. So yeah, they're a good pairing.
Yeah, I think they're a great pairing. And there's the book is a thriller and it's suspenseful, but if anything, Walt sometimes adds a little bit of comic relief to some scenes that are pretty hairy otherwise, but definitely, like I said, one of my favorite characters. So will he come back? I hope so, but you know, that's for the future writing to tell.
Yeah. I should just mention at this point, if you have a question at home, remember to write them in the chat box, and we can ask them and chat about them as we go along. Because you know, otherwise I'll just keep on talking. I've got plenty of stuff to ask about this book. So now, as we touched on the science and the DNA of this kind of the identification of the victim, how much research did you have to do to sort of get into that world and understand it?
Well, the idea came from an article I read, because I think it was in 2016 or 2018. This actually happened, where they developed this new DNA technology, and they made their first successful idea of a 9/11 victim, the first in years. And the grisly truth about it is, when 9/11 happened and the Twin Towers fell, there's a lot of remains that are, you know, that have never been identified. Pieces of bone, essentially, that they don't know who they belong to. And there's, you know, out of approximately 3,000 people who died in 9/11 at the Twin Towers, there's still many that are never been identified. So we've never been able to tell their family. We found, you know, their remains, we've identified them, because a lot of the fragments, for instance, a bone fragment that they found was too badly damaged and burned to actually extract DNA from it and then try to make a positive ID. And the way that I talked to the director of the lab in New York about this technique, and the way that they did it was, if a family member believes that their loved one was at the Twin Towers, they would deliver something to the lab, hair from, you know, their hairbrush or their the victim's toothbrush, from which the lab can then extract DNA. And then they have that on file. And then as they go through the remains and they're able to extract DNA from the remains, they can see if it matches any of the samples given. But they got to the point where the remains were so badly damaged and burned that they could not extract DNA from it until they developed this new technology, which essentially is they pulverize the bone, liquefy it, and then from that, they're able to extract DNA. And I found this process fascinating. Mark Desire, who's the director of the crime lab in New York, who explained the process to me, I found it fascinating. And so that was sort of the catalyst to the story. This is this new DNA technology identifies a victim the first time in years. And then Avery wants to initially tell that story before she discovers that the victim was under indictment for murder. And then she goes and pivots and tells the story of Victoria Ford and how she came to be accused of this brutal murder in 2001.
So we've got a question from the audience, and this is John's question, and it's 9/11 happened 20 years ago. Can younger readers appreciate the book without fully knowing 9/11?
Sure, because absolutely, because Andy, as you pointed out earlier, that is a catalyst. 9/11 is a catalyst to the story. The story is the book is not a 9/11 story. It has very little to do with 9/11. The idea that the victim was identified using DNA technology, that's just a catalyst to get this protagonist named Avery Mason interested in the story. And then once she gets to talk to Victoria's family, then she realizes Victoria's backstory of this murder that she was involved in. And again, 9/11 is just a catalyst. So younger people who didn't experience that day as viscerally as older people, no problem reading the book at all.
We've got another question, which is, are victims of 9/11 continuing to be identified today? I think you sort of answered that already. But...
Yeah, so again, this is a true story. So I haven't kept up because you got to remember I wrote this book 2 years ago, or certainly a year and a half ago when I was doing the research on it, and 2 years ago when I started the research. I haven't kept up on the technology, but the last time a victim was identified was in like 2016 was the last time that they used this technology to actually identify a victim. Now, when I talked to the lab director, he was optimistic that they were going to start making more identifications with this new DNA technology. And I haven't followed up on that to know if that's happened, but it's the DNA technology is true. It really exists. And yes, as recently as 2016, they've identified a victim who previously had not been positively identified.
All right. And we have another question from Grace, who is asking whether 20 years later is available in audiobook and e-reader. And I've got your Australian publicity sheet, and it's saying that it is available as an e-book. I'm not sure about an audiobook, but
yeah, so it should be. I looked this morning on the Australian Amazon page, and there's an ebook and a paperback that you have there, and an audio. So it might have been through Penguin Random House Audio that they did the audio. In the United States, it's done through Recorded Books. Strangely, the 20 years later has not been released yet in America. We are on a different schedule than Australia. So if it's unavailable in Australia, that's because my American publisher, audio publisher, has not released it yet. So it's not due to be released in America until December 28th. So if you're looking for it, and again, I'm not sure, I don't know if Penguin Random House did the audio in Australia or if it's through Recorded Books, but if it's not available now, it will be in December.
Yeah, so keep an eye out for it. And we have another question. Were you particularly cautious in your approach to this book because 9/11 is an event that holds so much for Americans?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to get the story correct about how people and victims are being identified. So that's why I talked to the lab director and thanked him in the acknowledgments that the work they're doing to honor the victims of 9/11 is heroic. When you talk, his name is Mark Desire, and when I talk to him, he is so passionate about making sure he gives answers to every family who doesn't have answers yet about whether their loved ones were in that building. Obviously, the answer is likely yes, but the closure that he can provide by positively identifying them goes a long way to the family. And so I was really careful with that. I wanted to make sure that I did justice when I told that part of the story. But again, other than using that as a catalyst, it's not, the book's not a 9/11 story. It's just, I've used that as a catalyst. I needed an event that happened years ago. And like I said, there was I sort of was inspired by this HBO documentary, and that's where the idea came from. But for sure, I had in my mind to be very careful as I sort of wrote around the topic of 9/11, because 20 years later, around the world, but specifically in the United States, it's still, and especially this year, because it'll be a sort of a hallmark anniversary, there's still a lot of pain that goes in with that day, as there always will be. So yeah, I was really careful when I was writing around that topic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're wrapping up pretty quickly, unfortunately. So my last question was, the book's out. You're working on the next book, I'm guessing?
Yeah, in about 10 minutes, I'll start writing on it. But yeah, I'm working on book 7. I'm working hard every day, as you probably are too, Andy. Sometimes the words come easy. Most of the time they come hard, but little bit by little bit, I'll get it done.
Yeah. How far ahead are you? Are you kind of a couple of books ahead in do you have like a schedule, or is it just one at a time?
I wish. I'm in the United States. I'm contracted through book 8, so I'm working on book 7, and once that's done, just like when I finish 20 years later, I turn right around and start the next one. So I'll have I'll get 8 done, at least for the United States contract, and then come up for air and see what's going on, and then probably go right back in and start the 9th one.
Yeah, I always was pretty amazed, like that Lee Child quote, where he kind of says, I think it's 1st of September, he's back at the keyboard starting the next book. And he's just like, man, that is a machine.
Like clockwork. Supposedly John Grisham starts on January 1st. I don't know if that's true. He doesn't have anything to drink on New Year's Eve. I don't know. But he says he sits down at the computer January 1st and tries to knock out a book in 6 months. And he does it every day without fail. And obviously he's done it for 40 straight years. So
yeah, it's a pretty good track record. Yes. All right. Well, it's been fantastic talking with you, Charlie. I've really, it's always great to talk writer to writer, and hopefully the audience has been enjoying what we've been talking, and hopefully they've been interested enough to go out and get themselves a copy of this, because it is it's a great read. And as Charlie said, we have it before America, so get in there and make sure you do a rating and that on Goodreads and all of those things, because that's really important. Not only as a little pat on the back for the author who might be having a bad day, but it's also really important because publishers read that stuff. If you want to read more of Charlie's books, that's what they're going to pay attention to. So yeah, thank you, Charlie, and thanks for letting us kind of intrude in your early morning writing time.
My pleasure, Andy. Thanks for having me.
No worries.
I hope we haven't kept you too much from your next book. That was a really interesting conversation. I loved that comment about write like a reader, read like a writer. I'm going to have to think a lot more about that, actually, because it seemed to me that the analytical process you went through when you taught yourself to write was presumably what is taught in a lot of writing courses.
It could be, but again, I had never been in a writing course, so I wouldn't know. But yeah, you can get down a rabbit hole when you start really analyzing that comment that agent made to me. It's really powerful.
It is very powerful indeed. And I just wanted to ask quickly, I was trying to think of whether there were many books set in 9/11 at the time of 9/11, or that involved 9/11, and I came up with a blank. Now, this is probably my ignorance. What do you think?
I'm sure there are. I can't think of one off the top of my head. I actually think that Emily Giffen wrote one a couple of years ago. She writes obviously more of a women's fiction, sort of a romance novel. But I think she had written one around that was based around 9/11 or the victim of a 9/11. But I can't think of many. Likely because it's maybe too soon, but again, hopefully people realize the book has very little to do with 9/11 other than using it as a catalyst, that sort of caused a murder investigation to be abandoned.
Yeah, and it's entirely respectfully told, as you said. I think it's also how what happens around us affects our lives. Historical events, for the want of a better word, can impact on completely different things that you wouldn't think they had anything to do with. But
correct.
Unexpectedly do. But yes, as Andy said, if you don't yet have your own copy of 20 Years Later or any of Charlie's other books, hop onto the Booktopia books page. Their details are on our website, and you can order the books there. And I'd also invite you to listen to our Bad Sydney podcast. You can hear Andy interviewing a couple of other people. And the latest podcast it's called The Victim Speaks, and it's about victim-led narratives in crime fiction based around a book called Before You Knew My Name by Jacqueline Bublitz, who's a new writer. And it's very interesting. We focus on the victim. Well, we focus on who killed the victim, but not on the victim himself, or in this case, herself. We also have a Bad Facebook page all about crime, so find out about that. Now, we're going to say goodbye soon, but I'll just tell you before we go about our next event. because we can't meet in September as we plan to do, we're going to have a mini online crime festival. We're going to have 4 women writers, very well-known women writers, who, as it happens, are bringing out new books in the next month or so. So I'm very grateful to them for that. We're going to start with Paula Hawkins. So, you know, you've all read Girl on the Train. This is a fantastic book. She's on the 8th of September, Wednesday nights at 6. Then we have Val McDermid, that fantastic Scottish writer, with the first book in a brand new series. She's on the 15th. Then we have got Karen Slaughter. We're back to the US, an extraordinary book. On the 20th, she'll be talking about it on the 22nd, and we'll finish with Anne Cleeve's incredibly atmospheric English writer who takes you all over the UK. And tickets are available now to all of those, so jump onto our website to book. Now it's time to leave you. Don't forget to tell all your crime-loving friends about Bad Sydney. Invite them to join our mailing list so they can find out all that we do and listen to wonderful events like this one. Thank you again, Charlie and Andy, and I hope everyone's enjoyed the evening as much as I have. Thanks and goodbye.